Books are the jigsaw pieces of history. When we study a massive campaign like the Battle of the Somme, how can books lead us on a pathway of understanding? What can we get from books about the Somme? One of the things that I've learned by studying the Great War for so many years is that books on the subject are the currency by which we learn about that massive conflict of 1914-18. But yet there are so many books on this subject. Where do you even begin with any aspects of the First World War and trying to make some sense of it and some sense of the history of the wider subject of this conflict? We've looked in previous podcasts at how books can relate to specific battlefield areas, where we've taken a bit of the Somme and talked about different memoirs that connect us to that and gain some understanding, hopefully deeper understanding of those areas through those books. You can go back through the podcast catalogue to find those. And in those we discovered how just a handful of books can inform us about one place. But as the anniversary of the Battle of the Somme approaches, it'll soon be the 1st of July. And a lot of recent questions for the Q&A episodes have been about what books to read. I thought we'd take this opportunity to look at the Battle of the Somme in 1916 as a subject and focus on how we might use books to increase our understanding of it. But let's just quickly remind ourselves of the history of the Battle of the Somme. At the end of 1915 was a change of command. Sir Douglas Haig became the Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force when Sir John French, the original commander, had been sacked after the failure of the Battle of Loos. Haig met with his French counterparts to discuss the offensive of the following year. He planned to attack in Flanders, a battle that would eventually become the Battle of Messines in 1917. But the French, being the major partner on the Western Front, wanted an offensive which would break the German lines in France, not Belgium. They were not interested in Belgium, really. And the obvious place to do that was down on the Somme, because the British have now extended their line south in late 1915 on into early 1916, and British units are on the Somme front, and soon it would become the join, close to the River Somme itself, of the British and the French forces. So if you're going to launch an Anglo-French offensive, that ground's the obvious place to do it, because they'd tried attacking in different parts of the front in September 1915 with the French offensive in Champagne and on Hill 145, Vimy Ridge, northeast of Arras, and the British doing the same at Loos. That coordination hadn't really worked, but if they attacked literally side by side, there could be a different outcome. The Battle of Verdun in February 1916 changed all of that and drew a lot of French manpower away, and the Battle of the Somme by 1916 became much more of a British affair than a French one. And on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, well over 100,000 British soldiers went into action, attacking deep, entrenched German soldiers on a chalk landscape with deep dugouts tens of feet beneath the surface, and the men in those dugouts come up and set up their machine guns and their rifle teams, and the men of Kitchener's army and territorials and what was left of regulars, volunteers to a man who went over the top that morning, walked into machine gun oblivion, a phrase I've used many times on this podcast. The Battle of the Somme rolled on throughout July and into August, despite the terrible 57,000 casualties on the first day, the blackest day of the British Army in its history. The battle continued in the southern sector, and gradually lines of German defences fell. And by November of 1916, the British Army, together with men from every corner of what was then the British Empire, Australians, Canadians, South Africans, New Zealanders, and many others besides, had come to fight in this battle, and by the close of it, 450,000 of them had become casualties, of which over 150,000 were dead. The Germans had suffered equally as many casualties, and the French, who'd taken part in the early operations, and then in increasing numbers some of the latter ones too, had brought the casualty lists on the Somme to a staggering amount of men, close on 1 million casualties in 1916. Historians began to look at the Battle of the Somme while it was still on, if you look at some of the contemporary accounts. And not long after the fighting ceased, John Masefield came and wrote that classic account of his journey across those Somme battlefields, of which this podcast is named after, The Old Front Line. That was published in 1917. Since then, book after book after book has been published. A huge library, and I'm kind of looking at my shelves now and seeing just how many books that I've got relate to the Battle of the Somme. And I'm not intending to go through them all. I mean, we'd be here forever. So where do we start with books, and what approach to use when we look at something like the Battle of the Somme? Now, this podcast is about the Somme. What we're about to discuss kind of applies to almost any battle, almost any subject, almost any campaign or period of not just the First World War, but almost any subject in history. And it's certainly how I've kind of approached my own study of both the First and the Second World War. Books are vital tools, not just the books that are in print now. You need to go back and find some of the older books, the rarer books, and particularly when we look at things like memoirs and unit histories, that's particularly important. Thankfully, companies like Naval and Military Press have done a lot of reprints, so for the rare and expensive volumes, we can find those reprinted in an affordable and accessible way. But I guess what I'm saying is, don't just look at what's on Amazon to do with the Battle of the Somme or any subject. Don't just look at what's in your local Waterstones or your independent bookshop. You need to go further than that. You need to delve into second-hand book dealers and online bookshops to find a much broader spectrum of books to give you the kind of in-depth understanding of a battle like the Somme that you need to really get to grips with that when you go out to visit it on the ground today. Now, there's a danger, I guess, that you could easily be kind of overloaded with the huge amount of books that there are out there, that you could go into one of these bookshops and even seeing what's in print now relating to the Somme, if you went to the military section at Foyles in London, which is an excellent bookshop. It's moved premises now, but it's still got a massive collection of military books, and it's a place that I've been going to since I bought my first Lynn MacDonald book back in the early 1980s. And you could just get really kind of put off from trying to make some sense of all this by the huge volume, if you excuse the pun, of books that are out there. So how do we approach this then? What's the best way of doing it? And what I've done over the years is to take what I called a layered approach, where we take the subject that we're discussing and that we're researching and that we're battlefield that we're wanting to visit, and then we take a layered approach to the reading and research for that. What does that equate to? Well, we're going to look at a series of 5 layers, from gateway books to the next level of detail in layer 2, to a 3rd layer where we'll look at official, regimental and divisional accounts. A 4th layer will include soldiers' memoirs, and then taking all that knowledge on campaign ourselves to that landscape of the First World War. The 5th layer are battlefield guidebooks. And I kind of haven't invented this, but this is kind of the way that I've approached it over the years. And when I talk to prospective battlefield guides, this is kind of what I say to them, is that you can't just pick a copy of Major and Mrs. Holtz off the shelf and think you know everything about the Battle of the Somme. That's just a kind of starting point from a guiding point of view. But if you're going to get to grips with a battle, a campaign, period of the First World War, then I think taking this layered approach is quite a good one. So let's look at that first layer, what I call the gateway books to the subject. And these are books that are easy to read, accessible, widely available, and they're not going to give you the details of every unit, of every battle within a battle, of every moment, of every second. They're going to set the scene for you, really, and give you a taste of it and hopefully whet your appetite to discover more. They don't have to be deep subjects or academic tomes. That's not their purpose. These are books to pique your interest, get a feel for the subject and period, and, like I say, help inspire you to discover more. So where do we start with these gateway books? Well, I mentioned Lynn MacDonald, that author who was really kind of at the pinnacle of Great War study when I first went to the battlefields in the early 1980s, who had interviewed hundreds, if not thousands, of veterans and begun to produce a whole series of books looking at their different war experience. And for the Battle of the Somme, her book called Somme, which came out in 1983, for me was a real kind of turning point in my own study of the Battle of the Somme. I was 16 when that book came out. My grandmother bought it for me for my birthday, and it was a cherished present from her, but also a gateway, literally a gateway to understanding more about the Battle of the Somme. That summer I went over to the Somme with my dad, and I'd read so much from that book, and she'd included a lot of decent maps and first-hand accounts, all of which I was able to really get a sense of experience and landscape and begin to pin that all together on the ground. But more importantly, Lynn MacDonald was a very, very good writer. She could write very well, and she was an engaging writer. So you really never wanted to put this book down. And that's what I think is a kind of common thing with these gateway books. These are books that you want to kind of devour, really, to get you on a process where you really want to know more. Lynn MacDonald's Somme book is not going to tell you the entire history of the Battle of the Somme. She only reproduces the memoirs and the quotes and the accounts from a fraction of the men that she interviewed, because otherwise it would have been volume after volume after volume, and this was a commercial book by a commercial publisher. But it sets a scene for you. And kind of bringing that more up to date, Richard Van Emden, in his own work with veterans published during the centenary, the Somme, the epic battle in the soldier's own words and photographs. And what I like about Richard's work is that he doesn't just follow on from Lynn MacDonald by giving us these incredible interviews that he's done with Great War veterans. Being fascinated as he is with private photographs of the First World War, he takes us into that area as well, and he uses rarely, if ever seen, ever published illustrations to help tell that story, set that story of the Battle of the Somme. And those two books are really fantastic starting points if you just want to take two books on the Somme and think, where am I going to begin my journey? Lynn MacDonald's Somme and Richard Van Emden's book on the Somme are really superb accounts to begin with. And again, about that time that I was first buying books on the Great War and reading about it and joining the Western Front Association, the chairman was John Giles, who had written several books on the First World War himself, and his book, The Somme Then and Now, which is a kind of landscape book where he's taken different parts of the Somme battlefield, and it's a bit of a travel log as he goes round it, and then history, and then images of the landscape on the Somme as it was then in the 70s and 80s when he published this book. That was another kind of gateway, and a book that for quite a few years, every time I was about to go to the Somme, it'd be one I'd get off the shelf and flick through and read a few extracts and look at some photographs, and it would give me inspiration of what to study next and where to travel next on those battlefields, that landscape of the Somme. And that's a good kind of gateway book too. And in the early days of the Western Front Association, they had some really first-class speakers at some of their meetings, and I got to meet Anthony Farrah Hockley, a veteran famous for his experiences in the Korean War, a man who'd served in the Parachute Regiment, written extensively on military history, and his 1964 book on the Somme, which although now is out of date in terms of the scholarship of it and the access that he had to records, many of the war diaries were still closed at that time when he wrote that book. Nevertheless, kind of going back to Lynn MacDonald, the thing about that book is Farrah Hockley was a really good writer, and the book flows very well and is very easy to read. This was a man who understood soldiering, was a born soldier himself, and really gives an incredible kind of perspective on the Battle of the Somme. So while there are some things I can look at it now and think, that's not quite right, we know a little bit more about that now, it still remains for me a really important gateway book to the Battle of the Somme. Now, as with all of these books that we're going to talk about, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There will be many of you saying, oh, why didn't you mention this? Oh, this is my favourite gateway book, or this is the one I read first. I get that, but I kind of have to give a kind of outline and approach here, and these are the ones I'm recommending. If you've got some others that you recommend, then please, in the podcast website page, in the comment sections, put your recommendations in there too, or tweet them to me, or put them on our Discord server, which many of you are using to kind of put notes on and additional comments about the podcast as well. And the link for that is in the show notes of this episode. So it's just a start. So that's the first layer, some gateway books to get us kind of into the mood of the Battle of the Somme, into the period of the Battle of the Somme, and get the voices of men who fought in the Battle of the Somme into our head through books like Lynn MacDonald and Richard Van Emden that give us those voices of the Great War. So the next level, having read these kind of starter books, the next level gives us another level of detail. We're building on what we've learned from those gateway books, and now that you've got the bit between your teeth and reading some of the above, you want to take that knowledge a step further. So where does this next layer take us? In this layer, we want some books that are going to allow us to understand the battle better, in greater detail, and fill out the basic outline of the campaign on the Somme and the events of 1916 that we found in that first layer. And the obvious one to start with, which perhaps some of you felt should have been in layer 1, is Martin Middlebrook's First Day of the Somme. Middlebrook kind of preempted Lynn MacDonald in the way that he researched, tracked down and interviewed Great War veterans, a journey that he began in the 1960s, leading to the publication of the First Day of the Somme the following decade. Middlebrook was not a trained historian. He had served as an officer in the British Army during national service, but he'd been a pig farmer, he'd worked for the Milk Board, and he was not a traditional kind of military historian, which in his case was not a weakness. It was a massive strength, because I think he kind of transformed the way military history about the First World War was written to an extent, and certainly his approach by highlighting individual experience, but then also underpinning that with really good research in the archives. If you look deeply into his book, you'll find that he consulted hundreds of war diaries and original paperwork. He looked at the correspondence between soldiers who'd served in the Battle of the Somme and the official historian, for example, and he drew out many stories from those. It wasn't just a group of old men in their homes that he went to interview and then he put it in a book. There was much more to this. There was analysis. And when I first read that myself as a teenager, I was kind of blown away by the detail. I couldn't take it in the first or even the second or third reading. I had to read it again and again. And it is a book that I go back to on a regular basis. It has these fantastic appendices with casualty lists and unit outlines and all kinds of other things. But the book itself, again, is very good writing. Middlebrook was a fantastic writer, and he focuses on individuals to help pin that story together, but he gives you a lot of detail. And I think once you've read that, you've got a very good understanding of the first day of the Battle of the Somme, written in language that you can understand. There has been a kind of follow-on from that came out during the centenary by New Zealand historian Andrew MacDonald, a book called The First Day of the Somme. And it's an excellent modern study, a counterpart really to Middlebrook's work, where he looks at sources that were not available to Middlebrook when he wrote them, or sources that Middlebrook would have found it very difficult to find in those far-off pre-internet days. And it kind of sits side by side with it. And that is a really great triumph on the part of an author that tries to take on a seminal book like Middlebrook's First Day of the Somme. So those two, both on the same subject, are really worth kind of reading almost in tandem, really, to build up your knowledge of that first day of the period of the Battle of the Somme, which went on for a lot more than one day. But the next layer of books as well by other authors that have used oral history but have also added context are also really important to this layer to build up our understanding. I'd begin definitely with Malcolm Brown's Imperial War Museum book of the Battle of the Somme. Malcolm Brown, another great writer, but also a TV producer who produced some fantastic documentaries about the First World War, looking at the Christmas truce, and the 1976 documentary about the Battle of the Somme, featuring Leo McKern as the presenter. He was a very talented, very intelligent man, Malcolm Brown, and a very kind and decent man as well. And in this book, he kind of brings together the archives of the Imperial War Museum, oral history recordings, letters, diaries, all kinds of other sources, and tells the story of the Battle of the Somme through the men and some women as well, and contextualizes that as he builds that story and moves it forward. And I think a kind of more recent counterpart to him has been Peter Hart, whose book, simply called Somme, does exactly the same kind of thing. Peter Hart was the oral historian for many years at the Imperial War Museum, so you can kind of see that that great institution, which I have a lot of time and admiration for, enabled some of its staff to use the material they had to produce these great books that help educate us further in subjects like the Battle of the Somme. And Peter Barton, who both before and during the Great War Centenary produced these absolutely huge landscape books looking at different aspects of the First World War through some of the records that he unearthed in archives like the Royal Engineers Archive, for example, using panoramic photographs, aerial photographs. He did a volume on the Battle of the Somme. And again, while that is not a detailed account of every day of the Somme and every aspect of it, then it is a really another layer through not just his own research and the stories that he tells, but through these panoramic photographs and the images that he sourced from much lesser known archives. If you want a day-to-day account, Chris McCarthy, another member of staff from the Imperial War Museum, wrote the book The Somme Day by Day, which, using the official history, he kind of chopped that up into a kind of diary of the Somme, where you can look on each day and see what battle was being fought by which unit, with some decent maps from the official history and other sources. And there's a more recent reprint of that one as well. So we've got books that kind of add depth and add colour to our understanding of the Battle of the Somme, with Malcolm Brown and Peter Hart and Peter Barton. And then you've got others who were, again, amateur historians coming in and adding to it as well. Gerald Glidden, who was a book dealer, who in the 1990s wrote a book called When the Barrage Lifts, which became a topographical guide to the Battle of the Somme, where he took every village, every town, key locations, and then he told the stories of those in a kind of gazetteer with a lot of detail from unit histories and war diaries and personal accounts and all kinds of other things. And that book really has stood the test of time, and is a great thing to have in the car or in your knapsack with you when you're walking or driving around those battlefields, where you go to a place, you can just whip it out and look up that location, and it gives you a kind of micro history of what happened there and some leads on some further research. And a chap called Barry Cattell, about that time, who lived in the south of France but spent a big chunk of the year up on the Somme battlefields, self-published in these kind of spiral books that were done on his home computer, which actually are really useful books to try and, again, pin together the chronology of the Battle of the Somme. He did 2 volumes, One Day on the Somme, which covers the 1st of July, and then 148 Days on the Somme, which covers the rest of the battle into November of 1916. He produced the maps, which are not always 100% accurate, but he used things like the official history and unit histories to put together, again, this framework of understanding of the Battle of the Somme. Even just this one battle, the Somme in 1916, is hugely complex, with every regiment of the British Army, every division that was on the Western Front at that time, men from all those, as we've said, far-flung corners of the Empire. This is one of those books that kind of helps you piece all that together, those jigsaw pieces of the battlefields that we often talk about. And then more recently, Paul Kendall wrote a book called Somme 1916, which follows in the footsteps of some of those, but genuinely, again, adds new material. Paul Kendall has written some really superb books on the First World War. other subjects like Neuve Chapelle and Zeebrugge, for example. And whenever I see one of Paul's books, I always know it's going to be quality, with a lot of stories that I haven't read before and some new material, which for a subject like the Somme is no mean achievement, really. So those are the kind of big studies, and they are only a handful of them. And then on top of that, of course, are specific battle studies that have often come out during that period. I remember going to a talk at the National Army Museum organised by the Western Front Association in the 1980s when Terry Norman gave a talk about High Wood just prior to the publication of his book, The Hell They Called High Wood. And in that, he focused on one part of the Somme battlefields, the Bois de Foucault, the High Wood, that dominated that fighting from July through to September of 1916, and produced this incredible book which highlights the infantry assaults in July, the cavalry charge, and then the final attacks using tanks when the men of the London Division went in and took what was left of the wood after 2 months of bitter struggle. And that was a very inspiring book for me, because it showed that you could take one tiny part of the Battle of the Somme and produce this fantastic detailed account drawing on all these different sources. And Terry Norman's book remains a classic in my mind, and it's sad really that he never went on to write more about the Great War. He'd written one, Armageddon Road, about Billy Congreve, VC, and his time on the Western Front from 1914 until his death on the Somme in 1916. But I think High Wood, The Hell They Called High Wood, remains the better of those two books, and a kind of classic, really, study of one part of the Somme. About the same time, a South African called Ian Oos wrote a book called Delville Wood, and he wrote a separate one called Longueval, giving the German account of the fighting around Longueval and Delville Wood, where, being a South African, he focused on the experience of the South African Brigade and their battle in the wood when 3,500 South Africans marched in, 750 marched out, and it's full of detail of individual soldiers and their accounts from their diaries and letters, and really kind of brought, for me, a fascinating and really atmospheric part of the Somme battlefield to visit. Delville Wood really brought it alive when you could wander the glades of that wood with the echoes of the stories that he tells in this book. So that is a really kind of highly recommended account of one part of the Somme. And more recently, we've seen Jonathan Porter produce these massive volumes about particular parts of the Somme, the front between Mametz and Montauban, and then up towards around Fricourt and just south of La Boisselle. And I think there's another volume in preparation. If you are a Great War fanatic, then those books by Jonathan really are incredibly detailed, with fantastic maps and overlays and huge amounts of research and really rare photographs in there as well. So that's kind of really from the British perspective, and I can't but mention the German one as well, because as I've said in a previous podcast quite recently, it's so important to understand the German side of things. Language is an issue, of course, unless you're a German speaker, but Jack Sheldon has spent many years translating German unit histories and official histories and producing a whole series of books about the experience of the German army in the Great War. And there is a volume on the German side of the Battle of the Somme by Jack Sheldon, which gives you an insight into their experience of the Battle of 1916. So that's our second layer. Our third one is where we bring in official, regimental and divisional accounts. Now this layer in some ways could be seen as optional. Perhaps the mention of official, regimental and divisional accounts will turn some people off. And I would warn you, it's quite literally a rabbit hole when you come to start looking into this and you find out just how many unit histories and official histories that there are out there. And it might at first appear that this kind of layer could be very, very dry. X or Y regiment at 3:10 in the morning attacks this location, suffers this amount of casualties, and the following list of officers are killed, wounded and missing, and X number of men. That is kind of one level of it. And I'm not saying that there aren't unit histories that are like that. There are. I'm looking again at my shelves and I can see one or two that are like that. But particularly in wartime raised units or territorial units, these men were often pretty well educated, and the men that survived went on to write unit histories for those units, were often well-educated and literate men, and they wrote some real classic accounts of the First World War through these regimental histories. So where to begin? Because there are so many of them. I mean, there are some bibliography of regimental and unit histories. And another question, if you're going to ask where to begin, also where to end. I mean, that is a good question, because I'm still discovering unit histories after 40-odd years of studying the Great War. I open a book list by someone like Tom Donovan, and I think, I know all the unit histories, the divisional ones, so on now, and then I open it up and there's one in there that I've never ever seen because it was only published of one example of about 50 between ex-officers of the unit and things like that. So it is an incredible rabbit hole. It is an incredible source to tap into, but it comes with a health warning, both from the amount of time you could spend doing this and the amount of money it might cost you in trying to trace some of these rare volumes. So what does it tell us then? If we're going to look at these official regimental and divisional accounts, what does it tell us and how does it help us to understand? So with layer 1, we've kind of got a segue to the subject. Layer 2 is built on that knowledge. Layer 3, we're coming down into some of the micro detail so that when we can walk down a track between the Thiepval Memorial and Lonsdale Cemetery via Utui Wood and the Leipzig salient, we can call on unit histories of units that were there to piece that story together to understand exactly what happened in what part of the field, at what time, at what cost. And that's where unit histories can give us a completely different level of detail, often backed up with exceptionally good maps, sometimes some original private photographs that were published in these books. And with rolls of honour in the back, we can kind of get an idea of the actual cost in terms of men's lives when we read the lists of names and the dates of death. But if we start at the higher level, we mentioned official histories. So James Edmonds, who was the official historian, wrote Military Operations, France and Flanders, 1916, which was 2 volumes, 2 red-bound volumes with 2 map volumes. The map volume was particularly detailed for the 1st of July, with maps showing each of the sectors, where exactly different units were located on those maps, so you can use them on the battlefields today, walk around with these maps and see that the 5th Londons were there and the London Scottish were there on the 1st of July at Gormacourt, and go down to Serre and work out where the Barnsley Pals were and where the Sheffield City Battalion was, and so on. And many more recent books have used these maps as source material to build up modern versions of those. The official history, of which this was a part, multi-volume set of books covering the whole war from 1914 to 18 on the Western Front, and then separate sections from Mesopotamia, Salonika, Gallipoli, and so on. It is an official account, so it's not written like a novel. There isn't kind of a lot of prose in there. It's detailed, it's basic, but it's factual. And it gives us the kind of basic, detailed, factual level of a story of an area of the battlefield. And it often refers back to casualty levels, which are incredibly useful if you're trying to work out how many men were killed or wounded and what the cost of an attack in a particular area of Somme was like. But it's not something that you're going to be sitting on a beach somewhere reading for a bit of summer reading entertainment. It's a reference book. And some of these unit histories can be the same, but like I say, some of them are very well written. So Banks and Chell, who were 2 officers in the 10th Battalion, the Essex Regiment, it's a book that I've quoted in this podcast before. They wrote the 10th Essex in France, which follows a Kitchener's Army Battalion of the Essex Regiment. It was part of the 18th Eastern Division that spent more time on the Somme than anybody else, and you can follow them through from the quiet period of 1915 through to the opening phase of the Battle of the Somme in July, and the fighting around Trones Wood, and then the later attacks on Thiepval in September, and then the winter of 1916-17 with the fighting on the Ancre and holding the line during that cold winter. And then the unit goes on to Arras and Ypres and various other places besides. But it's incredibly well written, a lot of reference not just to officers but ordinary soldiers as well, and well illustrated, and a kind of book that you could use to follow that battalion literally around the battlefields today, from cemetery to cemetery, memorial to memorial, and battlefield to battlefield. So those are the kind of unit histories that I focus in on. I've gone looking at my shelves, I can see some pretty dry, basic, entire regiment histories that cover the Gordon Highlanders, or the Middlesex Regiment. And while there's some element of detail in those, some are far less detailed. They're kind of whip-throughs of particular regiments' histories in different theatres of war. Royal Fusiliers in the Great War is a good example of that. It covers every battalion of a big regiment on every theatre of war in one volume. And you can imagine it can't really do justice to that. But individual unit histories are particularly good for enhancing our understanding of a particular battlefield. And we've started with the Kitchener's one. I often say, with territorial units, one of their strengths was that they were men from a particular community. They often had good old comrade associations, and there's often a link between that and the publication of a unit history and or the erection of a regimental memorial somewhere on the battlefields. And two that I would particularly point out from that point of view that are really good territorial battalion histories is the history of the 1st, 4th York and Lancs. They were the Hallamshire Battalion from Sheffield, a local territorial battalion in that area of South Yorkshire, one that I did a lot of research on with the 1st, 5th, who sadly never published a history, but the 1st, 4th and the 1st, 5th ran kind of side by side. It's a well-written, well-constructed history with a lot of micro detail, a lot of reference to ordinary men, and really good maps that allow you to then follow them on the ground. And sitting hand in hand with that is the beautiful, really high quality, perhaps one of the best single unit histories, and that's the history of the 1st 6th West Yorkshire Regiment. And I bought this because I purchased a little collection of photographs from an ordinary soldier who was later commissioned, who'd served with the 1st 6th West Yorks at Ypres in 1915, and these pictures were taken around Bosinger. And I wasn't really prepared for the size of this book. It's quite a large book, beautifully bound, with handmade paper and incredibly detailed, well-written account. A lot of ordinary soldiers' stories in there. The experience of war comes out of these pages, and not just the regiment did this, the battalion went here, the division was doing this. It's much more about the experience of being at Ypres, the experience of the gas attack they had there in December of 1915, going down to the Somme and watching the attack go in near Chapval on the 1st of July, and then being drawn into the fighting at the Schwaben Redoubt, and so on. But it's backed up with incredibly good maps, which are the currency to then help convert this information onto the battlefields as they are today. And it is a book that I just love sitting there holding and reading and flicking through. And I think there is a reprint of it, but if you can get a first edition, it costs you a fair amount, but it is a beautiful book. It's one of the best unit histories that you're ever going to buy. So what I've found is that some of the regular battalion histories written by regular officers can be pretty bland, but the temporary soldiers, the temporary gentlemen in Kitchener's and territorial army battalions, territorial force battalions, they can be a lot more detailed and give you a lot more. And individual unit histories of artillery units and engineer units are also worth dipping into because they're much smaller units. Again, they're men with particular skills and often kind of greater level of intelligence, and that is reflected in the way the unit history is written, and it gives you an insight into other aspects of what the army was doing, which is not just infantry fighting, understanding how the guns worked, how they reacted to situations on the battlefields, and how the engineers supported the infantry in the field is all part of our understanding of the Great War. So unit histories of those are very, very important. And when we get up to the divisional level, not every division published its own history. Not every regular division, not every territorial or even new army division did that. So there isn't a kind of complete set of them. And they've all been reprinted. All the ones that were published, they've all been reprinted by Naval and Military Press in both hardback and paperback. And if you kind of shop around on things like eBay, you can find some of the divisional histories, original ones, fairly cheaply. But kind of three that I'll just lift out, and they're all new army divisions that are particularly good for the Battle of the Somme, the history of the 18th Eastern Division, as we've mentioned, that division that was there for a very, very long time, from when it arrived on the Western Front in August 1915 through to the German withdrawal to the Hindenburg Line, with a short period where it went up into Flanders. It was there longer than anyone else on the Somme front and saw everything from the beginning to the end of the Battle of the Somme. And that divisional history is really important to kind of understand one big unit. I mean, a division is 20,000 men, 12 infantry battalions, a pioneer battalion, engineers, artillery, medical corps, army service corps, transport. Understanding those bigger formations, which are their own kind of self-serving, self-supporting units. It's a really crucial kind of jigsaw piece in our understanding of how the Battle of the Somme progressed. And sitting side by side with that are histories of two other divisions. The 23rd Division, quite a big one, fantastic pull-out maps, a lot of detail. That was a division that had some of its units kind of torn away from it, others attached to it, and it gives you a really interesting insight into that early period of the Battle of the Somme, and then it would return for some of the later fighting when the weather got truly atrocious, and it gives, again, bit of an insight into that, but the maps are really good in that divisional history. And then a tiny little kind of almost pocket book with a beautifully coloured cover is the history of the 25th Division. Had been at Vimy Ridge when the Germans had attacked with mines there in May of 1916, and then it came down and served in the Chappeville sector for quite some time in the early summer of 1916. There's a lot of detail in there because that was its first big operation after Vimy, so there's a lot of detail about units, and in the back of it, it reproduces the citations for gallantry awards right down to military medals, which is a kind of micro history that you can use to reconstruct what was happening in individual units, even in individual trenches on some of those battlefield areas. So 3 really good divisional histories there, the 18th Eastern, 23rd and 25th. No accident, I think, that they are all New Army divisions written by temporary soldiers, not professionals. Now, there are some other really good divisional histories, but those, I think, kind of give you a flavour of it. And then, as kind of sitting, again, side by side with those official histories, battalion histories, unit histories, divisional histories, Ray Westlake, who was a prolific author on not just the First World War, but many aspects of military history, started to kind of access war diaries and put them into a usable format in a book. And he published a series of British battalion books. And one of those was British Battalions on the Somme, where every regiment of the British Army is in there, and then a summary of their war diary from the date of their arrival on the Somme through to when they left. And again, a useful kind of book to have with you when you visit the battlefields. And if you go in the cemetery and you see a line of men from a particular unit and the date of death, you can flick straight into this book, see what the unit was doing on that day, and then get a bit of an insight. And that leads you down more rabbit holes, to use that phrase again, finding out a bit more about what was going on in that area. And in recent years, going back to the 90s, Mike Steadman and John Cooksey were two kind of pioneering authors in this. When John Cooksey wrote the book on the Barnsley POWs, Mike Steadman did the Salford POWs. These are these big format books published by the Barnsley Chronicle in the 1990s. And since then, a whole series of unit histories have been published by what is now Pen and Sword Books, looking not just at POWs battalions, but territorial units, New Army units, and lots of different regiments. And there are some really good and useful volumes in that kind of series that they've done, which again helps you to kind of delve into the next layer of detail. You've had your segue, you've got your next layer of information to flesh out the Battle of the Somme, but then you're looking at particular actions at Schwaben Redoubt, or down in front of High Wood, or in the assault on Mametz Wood, and all these kind of different places on the Somme battlefields. And then when there's no divisional or brigade or battalion history covering a particular area, these more recent studies, often by so-called amateur historians who've really got to grips with local sources because they know them well, because they're from those areas, really give us massive, important insight into how these units were formed, how they performed on the battlefield, and what their experience was in some of these key locations on the Somme front. So that's our third layer. Our fourth layer is soldiers' memoirs. Now, if this previous layer was a rabbit hole, this one is even deeper and is a sure way to bankruptcy. I mean, there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of Great War memoirs that cover the Somme in some kind of aspect, and new accounts are being discovered all the time. A couple of years ago, I remember coming across one of a soldier in the Royal Fusiliers that had been found. They'd been written many years after the war and now only just published. So where to start with these? Now, we've had a lot of episodes where we've looked at different aspects of soldiers' memoirs, And I'm not going to kind of go into dozens and dozens of these because, again, we could be here for another few hours easily. But in terms of the Battle of the Somme, let's throw in a few titles to kind of get you going, really. And if we're going to start with one, let's start with J.C. Dunn's The War the Infantry Knew. Now, Dunn was the medical officer of the 2nd Battalion Royal Welsh Fusiliers, and this is a kind of mixture between a unit history from Layer 3 and a memoir from this layer. Dunn interviewed hundreds of men in his unit, corresponded with them, and got them to write accounts which he wove into this story of one battalion. So it's a kind of oral history of an infantry battalion on the Western Front, with a big chunk of it, of course, with their Somme experience, particularly in 1916. So that's kind of a good starting point. But in terms of what individuals wrote, Robert Graves' Goodbye to All That, which I've mentioned many times in this podcast. I had a paperback version of that tucked in my rucksack when I first went to the Somme in 1982. Graves' account, which Sassoon called the greatest work of fiction ever written about the Great War, nevertheless remains a kind of seminal memoir of the First World War, which you must really read. And his account of being on the Somme front during a quiet period and then going into action and being wounded in front of High Wood in July of 1916 is a classic account. Robert Graves was a curious, strange individual in many ways, but he was clearly a good soldier and one that was able to relay the experience of trench warfare and battles on the Western Front in an understandable and a way that I think kind of adds something to it. I remember sitting on parts of the battlefield where he'd fought, reading that book, and the pages kind of literally came alive as I sat there and looked across that landscape, thinking of the words that I just read in the pages of his book. And a man of his own battalion, Bernard Adams, wrote nothing of importance. That's not really about the big battle of the Somme in 1916. It's written about the quiet period beforehand, and is an excellent account of what all quiet on the Western Front really meant to ordinary soldiers, what it was like to hold the line when you weren't going over the top with bayonets fixed and going into action. It kind of gives you an insight into that. But when we get down to the kind of nitty-gritty of what happened between July and November of 1916, you can't go wrong with Frank Richards' Old Soldiers Never Die. Big Dick, rough and tough, regular soldier, served in India before the war, ended the conflict with the DCM and military medal, and was a signaller in the 2nd Royal Welsh Fusiliers and served in front of High Wood. Incredible account of that. And he knew Siegfried Sassoon, the war poet, and he knew Robert Graves, so it kind of weaves in through some of their work as well, and is, importantly, a voice from the ranks. And kind of following on from that, we've got I.L. Reid's Of Those We Loved, originally published in the 90s and then reprinted relatively recently by Pen and Sword. He was an ordinary soldier in the Leicestershire Regiment, a Sussex lad from Eastbourne, who was on an apprenticeship in Leicester when the war broke out, and he served with one of the service battalions of the Leicesters in the fighting at Bazantan Wood. And the very moving, detailed description of being in the line there and seeing what the cost of that battle was to those Leicester pals and how it affected all the little villages and communities in and around Leicester when the men were killed and wounded in that tough battle of the 14th of July 1916. And Reid illustrated it with some of his own drawings and sketches that he made both during and then in years after the Great War. Norman Gladden was an ordinary soldier who I had the privilege of meeting him. He's a veteran, member of the Western Front Association, and I spoke to him about his Great War experiences. He'd written 3 books on the subject, of which Somme 1916 covers his time there with the Northumberland Fusiliers, and it follows his route from arrival on the Somme through to some of the mid-period battles. And then when the conditions on the battlefield got really atrocious, he talks about the effect of trench foot on ordinary soldiers and what it meant to the men who were suffering with this. It's one of the best accounts that I've read of that. Again, well-written, engaging books. He did another one about his experiences at Ypres in 1917, and he went to Italy in the final phase of the war, and his book Across the Piave covers that period. Giles Eyre was another ordinary soldier. He served with the King's Royal Rifle Corps in the fighting around Lewes in early 1916 and then came down to the Somme, and he's another one whose kind of rendezvous with High Wood brings the pages of the Battle of the Somme into sharp focus around that part of the Somme battlefields. High Wood seems to have drawn in so many people, had such an effect on those that were there, that we've got all these different accounts of it. His book was always very difficult to find. I managed to pick up a first edition in a bookshop, in one of those mythical Sussex bookshops all those years ago, but it's been reprinted a few times since. And he is pretty graphic in his detail of what the war does to ordinary men, both physically in terms of wounds and terrible, appalling death, and also the psychological wounds that soldiers have as well. So a book worth dipping into. And Edward Lynch, an Australian who served on the Somme during the winter of 1916-17 and in the fighting during the latter part of that period, that is a kind of classic account of trench warfare that is a rewriting of some of his diaries and I think some of his letters as well. It's a really good account, a recent book, easy to find and very, very accessible. So there are, we've only touched on a handful of memoirs there. We could go on, and I'm kind of again looking up at my shelves and seeing lots of different books that I could have talked about, but the idea is to get into these memoirs, look at these memoirs, go back through other podcast episodes where we've talked about memoirs. Then that is a really good kind of layer of this to have. The memoirs are particularly good if you are one of those many people. People like me who were able to interview Great War veterans were pretty rare. Most people were not yet born or doing other things. So this is your way to connect with someone who was there through their memoirs. Like any oral history, like any memoir, they're flawed because we're seeing one person's view of the conflict. So we can't say that these quite literally are the pages of truth when it comes to every aspect of a subject like the Battle of the Somme, but it gives us an essence of the experience of war. We can see it through the eyes of one person who was there, and I think the tales of ordinary soldiers are particularly important to get that idea of what the experience of life in the ranks was like compared to people like Robert Graves, who were infantry officers. So that's layer 4. Layer 5 is when we bring those 4 layers together, where we've got our segue, we've got our in-depth books, we've had our unit histories, and now we've had our memoirs, and we're then wanting to take all that knowledge across to the landscape of the Western Front today. And layer 5 are battlefield guidebooks. This is a 5th and not exactly a final layer, because we could add different layers of different source material to this. But what it does is help us transform what we find on the written page into what we can then find on the landscape of the Great War today. Guidebooks began within months of the war ending. The Michelin Tire Company actually published some guidebooks, not to the Somme, but to the Marne, while the war was still going on. And then they eventually published 2 volumes covering the Somme in French and English that were there to feed some of those early pilgrims with information to get them around those battlefields when they were still shattered by 4 years of conflict, and there was hardly a blade of grass, let alone hotels and places for these people to go and visit. And then in the 20s and 30s, more and more guidebooks were published covering different aspects of how to visit the battlefields. Graham Seaton Hutchison, whose memoirs I could have included in layer 4, he wrote a book called Pilgrimage, which is a kind of mixture of history and memoir and then guide to actually visiting the battlefields for veterans who want to travel to see the battlefields where they had fought, which makes fascinating reading for us all these decades later. And those battlefield guides continued up until the late 1930s. There was a kind of a resurgence with the publication of The Great War, I Was There, which was a part work magazine which looked at personal experience in the Great War, and then a series called 20 Years After that then did the battlefields of the Great War then and now, then being the war and now being the 1930s. And they're available as individual magazines you can often pick up, or as bound volumes with 3 different volumes, a first and second and a supplementary volume. And although they're not guidebooks, they're incredibly useful to help understand the battlefields and see the battlefields as they were just before the Second World War. World War II then kind of gets in the way, and you don't see guidebooks being published about the First World War battle sites in the 1950s and 60s. Even during the 50th anniversary, you don't really see that kind of thing. It takes until the 1970s when Rose Coombs, MBE, Special Collections Officer at the Imperial War Museum, publishes BEF, Before Endeavours Fade. This one-volume guidebook by After the Battle, who just started a World War II Then and Now magazine. They published Rose Coombs' book covering the First World War battlefields from top to bottom, from the Belgian coast right down to the Swiss border, with lots of material about Flanders, the Somme and Verdun and various other battlefields besides. And that was the first guidebook that I bought and the first guidebook that I took with me on my early trips to the battlefields. Having gone with my school, I went back a few months later with my dad to the Somme with Rosie Coombs' book tucked in the same rucksack that I had Robert Graves's Goodbye to All That. And while John Giles's Then and Now books were kind of guidebooks in a way, we don't really see the publication of new guidebooks to the battlefields until the 1980s and 90s with the arrival of the Battleground Europe series from Pen and Sword. The original one was written by Nigel Kay with the assistance of Tony Spagnoli, and then this became a series of little kind of pocket books you could tuck into your jacket pocket and take with you to different battlefields, resulting in dozens and dozens of titles covering different corners of not just the Western Front, but Gallipoli and Italy and other battlefield sites besides. And these are incredibly good for focusing on one area. There's a book on Boom Ravine. I mean, who knew that Boom Ravine, one tiny little ravine, fought over only in a matter of hours, really, on a couple of days of 1917 at the tail end, the fag end of the British Army's experience on the Somme. Who knew that a book could be written on that? Trevor Pidgeon, who wrote that, produced a very detailed account of that one tiny part of the Somme experience. And it was my first kind of entry into publishing, because Pen and Sword, through the Battleground Europe, published my Walking the Somme in 1997, and then I went on to write others on particular parts of the Somme and guidebooks to other parts of the Western Front battlefields at Ypres and Arras, and I've still got to finish that one on the Forgotten Front. Around about the same time, Martin Middlebrook, famous for his first day of the Somme, and he went on to write other books, both on the First World War and World War II and even the Falklands. But with his wife Mary, they travelled all around the Somme battlefields. They tapped into people that had visited the Somme for many, many years, and I was able to kind of provide some information to him. Martin Middlebrook was a gentleman. If you helped him in any way, he'd always put you in the acknowledgements, and he'd always send you a copy of the book. And it was quite a hefty book, white cover, published in the 1990s, an in-depth guide to the Somme battlefields with a lot of analysis of cemeteries and what the battlefields told us, and for me, kind of hugely influential in the way that I began to see those battlefields in a different way. So that was a really kind of landmark book. Just as he'd done with his study of the first day of the Somme, this was a landmark guidebook to the First World War battlefields. And then in the late 90s and on into the early 2000s, Canadian historian Norm Christie published a series of books called King and Empire that looks at the Canadian battlefields of the First World War from Ypres through to the Somme. It's a really good volume about Canada at Courcelette. And Jerry Merland and John Cooksey, John Cooksey had written the books on the Barnsley Powers, teamed up with Jerry Merland, and they wrote a series of guidebooks covering different aspects of the Western Front with 2 volumes about the Somme battlefields. And in more recent times, the late, great Dave O'Mara, published a series of books about the French army on the Somme and a guide to their battlefields. We've kind of not touched on the French side of stuff because there is so little published in English. And Nigel Cave and Jack Shelton also published some Battleground Europe books looking at the German experience on the Somme at Chappval, for example. So this was the kind of usefulness of these guidebooks. As popularity and interest in the First World War grew, guidebooks reflected that with the huge volume of them that was published, and then the kind of subjects that they covered in the pages of those guidebooks. And that has left us a huge amount of material that we can dip into to look at that layer, that fifth layer, where we take our knowledge and we transpose that onto the landscape as it is today. So hopefully then, what we've managed to do here is outline an approach to tackling a subject like the Battle of the Somme, and gain a bit of an idea as to how you might begin to understand its complexity through having this layered approach to studying it and reading about it through these different types of books. When you visit that landscape of the Western Front, on one level, if you let it, it will just be one-dimensional, unless you can bring in the jigsaw pieces of history, of which books on the subject, in this case the subject of the Battle of the Somme, are just one. On top of that, as we've said, you can have trench maps, air photos, war diaries, and there are so many other sources. But books make those battlefields accessible, and more importantly, understandable. The veterans themselves try to make sense of the war through the books they wrote. Men like Robert Graves and Frank Richards, part of the reason for writing those books was to understand their own war. And for men, veterans who never penned a word, and many of those that I interviewed, of course, had never done that, reading other people's accounts, which some of them had done, was a way to understand and contextualize their own war experience. How had others seen their war, and how could reading about that help them? Books offer us snapshots, glimpses into the war, which we can build on, as we've shown, layer by layer. The words on their pages bring that rich history to life and lead us along the pathways on a journey, a never-ending journey of discovery and of understanding as we travel along that ever-present old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at SomCorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.